Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, the February meeting of the Organ District Organist Association, the YDOA. We're continuing the pattern of broadcasting or podcasting, whatever you want to call it, at 7:30 in the evening. But this video will, of course, be available for a while after that, so that anyone who wishes may watch it during the next few days or even weeks if they would like to. Just a brief reminder that on Saturday the 20th of March at 7:30, Jo Peach will be playing her fascinating recital of piano music by organ composers. That, of course, will be online as well. Regarding the April meeting, that I can tell you will now not, unfortunately, be taking place at Huddersfield. So the message regarding that for the moment is simply watch this space and we'll let you know further details as soon as we can. Certainly we will try and reinstate the masterclass scenario at some point as soon as we're all unlocked. So we're delighted this evening to be joined by Dr. Philip Moore, the Organist Emeritus, indeed the Director of Music Emeritus of York Minster, who is going to be talking to me about composing for the church. As you know, this was to have been a face-to-face talk that Philip would have given last September, but having put it off several times, we really felt now that an online interview could probably cover the same ground, faute de mieux. Philip's biography is well known to us, but just to remind everyone, he was born in Maidstone. He was a student at the Royal College of Music. He became organist of Eton College and then assistant organist to Dr. Alan Wicks at Canterbury Cathedral. In 1974, he went to Guildford Cathedral and he came to York in 1983, as we know. He retired in 2008 and he became president of the Royal College of Organists in 2015. So Philip, welcome. And I have my questions for you in 6 sections. They are, just to summarise, how things began, influences that you have felt, the church and its influence, how you compose, then something which I've called the nitty-gritty, which includes a bit on trade secrets, if I may so describe it, and finally a few general questions to finish. So first of all, how things began. When did you first start to compose?
I think I was still in single figures. And I recall that I used to write tunes in my head once I went to bed at night. And then I would go downstairs in the morning and play them. But at that stage, I never wrote anything down, which is a bit of a shame, although they would have been quite awful. And I suspect that a lot of them would have been hymns and a few little very small instrumental pieces for the piano. When I became a little bit more proficient on piano and theory, I started writing things down. And when I got to Maidstone Grammar School at the age of 11, the music master there was wonderfully far-seeing, and he encouraged us all to write music. So I wrote carols and instrumental pieces and a piece for the school orchestra. So it has always been part of my DNA to write music.
So how did you, when you were very little, and you say you went to bed and thought of musical themes, how did you actually think of them? Did you think of them in terms of notes on a page or on the piano, or just did you just hear them in your head?
I heard them in my head, and I also heard the harmony.
Right.
For some reason, I have always been very keen on harmony. And it was always, the harmonies were very conventional, but they were obviously, to my ears in those days, they were very nice.
Kind of elements of a wunderkind.
Oh, well, no, not at all, not at all. Just part of my musical DNA.
So when did you start to write choral music, or was indeed choral music the first thing you wrote when you sat down writing those hymn tunes by improvisation, as it were?
I suppose I was about 11 or 12, and as I say, we were encouraged to write carols, and my first effort, just going back a bit, when I was young, until I was about 13, there were only two composers who mattered to me, Bach and Handel. And I used to improvise in the style of Handel, or what I thought was in the style of Handel. And Bach was and still is a towering figure. And I played the shorter piano pieces of Bach. And then at school, we sang the St. Matthew Passion, or excerpts from it. And incidentally, one of the tenor soloists was a contemporary of mine at school, Philip Langridge, who was actually known more in those days as a very fine violinist. And he went to the academy as a violinist, but came out as a singer. But we sang. We obviously didn't sing it all, but it was in the days before my voice broke, and I was assigned the Ripieno chorus in the first movement, and I couldn't believe what a welter of counterpoint and how this chorale tune fitted into everything. I was completely bowled over by it. And there are other movements that I just loved. I thought the final movement of the first half, O Mensch Divine, and then in English, I don't know the German, I Would Beside My Lord, which starts with a lovely oboe solo. And I started writing pieces with oboe solos at the beginning. So he dominated my musical thought.
So how old were you then when you heard the Matthew Passion for the first time?
Well, I suppose I was about 12. My voice hadn't broken. I suppose 12 or 13.
And therefore, you would say, I guess, that you were influenced more sort of globally in that Bach and Handel are global rather than anything local that had an effect on you.
Yes, I wasn't a chorister at a cathedral, so we heard church music at church, and that made a sort of impression, but it was Bach to begin with, and then and nobody else. I was really not interested in any other composer. My father used to play Chopin, and it slightly left me cold. And then my father bought a radiogram and started buying long-playing records. And one day he came home with Vaughan Williams' Fifth Symphony, and I was completely bowled over. And so I started writing in the style of Vaughan Williams. And that went on for quite a long time. Then I heard the Howells Colreg Te Deum on Record Review. And again, I was rooted to the spot. I can remember where in the house I was. I was outside the kitchen, and this fabulous sound, those melismas, and that huge cadence, which goes on forever, it left me bowled over, and I started writing like Howells. And then, of course, I heard Like as the Heart and all the other things, and the carols like Here is the Little Door, and so on. And so that really was what happened.
Maybe you better explain to people what a radiogram is. I mean, I remember what a radiogram is, but I don't know whether everybody will know these days.
Well, it was when long-playing records came into existence, and it had a radio attached, which we used to call the wireless, of course, in those days. Yeah. And you could put 2 or 3 records onto above the turntable, and they would drop. Once you'd finished the first side, another record would drop down. It didn't do the records any good, but it was the first. Sorry?
No, it usually worked, if I remember. But there were
it did actually, yes. Certainly, it gave us all a huge amount of pleasure.
Oh, indeed, absolutely. Yes. So would you say a lot of people, when they are young, have particular pieces or a particular piece in their head which guides them in what they like and what they write? Would you say for you it was the Fifth Symphony of Vaughan Williams then?
I think it was mannerisms and style that I wanted to imitate. I didn't want to write the Fifth Symphony again.
So to continue with the influences aspect, to go, I suppose you might say, from the sublime to the ridiculous, you grew up, as I did, in the age of the dawn of pop music. We always rather defamed it, I suppose, at the time, but in retrospect, do you think it affected you for good or otherwise?
It didn't affect me at all. It passed me by.
Mhm.
So when in later life, I started to like Elton John because the children would want to play Elton John tapes on long car journeys. So I really did appreciate him. But otherwise, in my teens, I just didn't listen to it at all.
I suppose you were a little bit not quite of the right generation to have appreciated the Beatles, for instance.
No, they came along when I was a student. And I suppose I heard the music they wrote and performed, and I think I quite enjoyed it. But just going back to the influences, though,
Yes,
because there are a whole lot of other composers who entered my musical orbit.
yes.
And after Howells, there was Britain, um, Requiem, the Sinfonia de Requiem, Ceremony of Carols, Missa Brevis. Then I got hooked on Hindemith. When one day on the radio I heard the Symphony Magister Mahler, and I still think he's a wonderful composer. He's underrated, but his best pieces are fabulous. Then it was Tippett with the double concerto, Bliss, the Color Symphony, which I became very keen on. I discovered John Ireland hearing his piano concerto, which again my father bought, and it was the first piece of John Ireland's that I had heard. And when I got to know some of the church music, I was slightly disappointed. I now know that a lot of it is very finely wrought and so
Not
forth.
the best music, is it? Things like I
No,
see are really not the height of Ireland's achievement,
they
certainly.
aren't. And I think he wrote church music in order to satisfy probably not a terribly good choir. But certainly his songs and the piano concerto, the concerto pastorale, all those sort of things are so good. Um, and then I was hit by De Rufflet, as you will know.
Yes, yeah.
um, and then Elgar, I heard the Dream of Gerontius, the symphonies, and fell for them deeply.
So just to return to your love of Bach, someone once said that if Bach had not been employed by the church, he wouldn't have written a single cantata. So it's perhaps a rather obvious question, but how much did the church actually influence what you wrote?
I think a great deal, partly because there was a need. When I was at Canterbury, we used to have a week or two of men's voices only. And Alan was very good at digging up extraordinary repertoire, but he said, write things for us, will you? And so that's the origin of all those men's voices service that I wrote. And I used to foist on both the Guildford and the York choirs.
So you simply wrote it because it was needed, and that was where you were working, much
Yeah,
in the same way as Bach, of course, had to.
yes. So I think I wrote very few anthems when I was at Canterbury, more when I was at Guildford.
Yes. Composers such as Tournemire, thinking of composers for the church, have been driven very much by plain song to the exclusion, in his case, of much else. I wonder how important plain song is to you in what you write.
Very important. The first plainsong pieces obviously were the men's voices services, and then All Wisdom was the next one. And I love plainsong, and we were able to do yards of it in Guildford and indeed in York. And I used to love the men's voices services when we sang plainsong psalms, either accompanied or unaccompanied.
Yes.
And I valued those times hugely. So I think plainsong is very important. In fact, the last piece I've just written for the Guildford Cathedral Old Choristers is based appropriately enough on Veni Creator, because the cathedral is dedicated to the Holy Spirit. And so I've incorporated the plain song in that particular piece. So I think it occupies a big chunk of my musical thought.
And the plain song ending that you have, that magical moment at the end of All Wisdom Cometh from the Lord, is reflected, I think, at the end of your big cantata De Profundis. Am I right?
Yes, that is not actually plain song, but it's plain song-like.
Exactly.
Yes. So that I think it dominates, especially when I'm writing slow, expressive music.
So you mentioned Howells as a prominent church composer who had influenced you. Was there anybody else?
I think Britain, his church music, obviously had a big influence. And strangely enough, when I did my BMAs in Durham, I had to work through Palestrina 5-part counterpoint. And I actually quite enjoyed it and realized the wonderful webs of sound that you get when you're writing polyphony. So I think he was probably an influence. And also Stanford has been a big influence because he brought technique to church music and all sorts of little tricks that he used to employ, like spacing out the cadences, thinking of the end of Stanford in A, Nunc Dimittis, or the end of Stanford in G, Nunc Dimittis. And those sort of gestures that he employed, I think influenced me a great deal.
He wasn't a very nice person, of course. I think somebody once said he was the devil's own job to get on with, but he was a very clever fellow.
He was, and he wasn't a great composer, but he was a very, very fine one. And I think in the early days, I think he was in the ascendant over Elgar, and of course they disliked each other intensely.
Didn't he say he'd have given his right arm to have written Jerusalem at one stage?
No, it was Gerontius.
Oh, Gerontius was it? Okay.
Yes, yes, that was what he would have given his right arm. But then he said that Gerontius stinks of incense, which of course, as an Irish Protestant, he might well have objected to it. But interestingly enough, on those two composers, there is talk, or has been talk, that the Enigma variations are based on the Benedictus from the Requiem of Stanford, which Benedictus, Benedictus, which is the start of the Enigma variations in the major. Oh no, in the same key actually. So that's a thought.
Well, it's surprising what the cross currents can do in that kind of thing, particularly with music of the same generation, of course.
I know. And there was a story that he went to see Elgar to play through the Requiem, and then Elgar wrote the Enigma variations. How true that is, I don't know. No. But Stanford did have the decency to go to Lady Elgar's funeral, even though he was unwell. So.
So we come on to the section now which I've called the church. We've seen a lot of changes in the church during our lifetimes. Has that affected what you write, do you think?
Yes, in that the liturgies, the changing liturgies, I was encouraged, especially at Canterbury, to write pieces which set the modern liturgies, which are on the whole pretty ugly. And I think what I try to do with the settings that I've done, say of Series 3, is actually to impose musical ideas on them rather than allowing the words to speak, because they don't speak in the way that the 1662 liturgies speak. There's no inner rhythm. And so I think you have to be very strict with your musical ideas, which is what I try to do.
It's the kind of opposite of Stainer, of course, who took wonderful texts and wrote pretty lousy music.
I know.
Lousy texts and written wonderful music for them.
Well, I don't know about that, but of course, interestingly enough, the music that I'm most often asked to write over the years, it has been settings for the Mass, and almost invariably I've been asked to write settings in Latin, and I think Latin is very acceptable. I remember when we were at York in the early days, there were objections from certain quarters, I won't mention who, when they didn't like Latin because it was not English. And then, of course, we sang Mozart masses, and that sort of shut them up. So
Progressive clergy.
I know. Oh, I know.
Progressing where, I would like to know.
Exactly. Mm.
But the environment of cathedral music sees you in constant contact with voices. Is it possible to explain how you learnt to write for voices?
I think I'm always learning. But when I was at Canterbury, Alan was very good indeed and clever at getting the choir to sing awkward pieces. And when I went to Guildford, I didn't really have that technique. And it was at Guildford really that I decided what worked and what didn't, and what people found difficult and what they didn't. And so I think I learned by trial and error. And also, I learned that pieces need not be too complicated. I've often told composition pupils, of whom I've had a few, write in 4-part harmony. The Messiah, apart from Lift Up Your Heads, is in 4-part harmony. St. John Passion, 4-part harmony throughout. And this endless divisi, which goes on in some modern church music, is very difficult to do, partly because you need so many singers.
It sometimes depends, I've always thought, on which particular voices you've got in your choir. For instance, if you have a wonderful tenor soloist, then that will inspire you to write a tenor solo and so forth. Bach once had a very good violinist in Leipzig, and he wrote music for with violin solo parts in his cantatas when he happened to be there. So has that happened to you, or?
Yes, it has. In fact, all wisdom cometh from the Lord is an example, because we had in Guildford a very good bass who still sings well, Simon Della, son of Alfred. And he has a big bass solo in that particular piece, and it was designed for his voice.
Yes, I'm sure we've all heard his name. Thinking a bit about the clergy, if perhaps we dare do so for a minute, one of the most annoying expressions that I hear from them is that church music, and often music in a wider sense, must be accessible. That extraordinary meaningless word, but what do you think they mean by that?
I think they mean what they like. And what is accessible to one person is not accessible to another.
Quite so.
And I often tell the story. When I was at Guildford, we went to Germany, and we hired a coach from the Ford Motor Company. And they sent a driver who was from the East End of London, and he told us very blue jokes in the pub the first night, which we bettered, of course. And then the next day, he was going to sit in the coach for the rehearsal. I said, "Come in and listen." And he came in and heard us rehearsing Lastus Mass, Bel Amphitrit Altera. Can you
remember it well? Yes. Yeah.
And he was bowled over. He was a man who knew nothing about music, nothing about religion, only knew pop music, and he couldn't believe what he'd heard. So you don't know what is accessible to one person is accessible to something else.
Quite so. I suppose it's a bit of a generalisation, but would you say overall that the clergy have helped you or got in your way as far as musical composition is concerned?
On the whole, I'm happy to say they've helped. In the early days, particularly in York, there was this desire for the congregation to join in. And my retort always was, well, we don't join in the prayers, we don't join in the lessons. Why should the congregation want to join in the Magnificat? And that seemed to die a death. But the person who influenced me most of all was the Dean of Guildford, Tony Bridge, who was there for my whole time at Guildford. And he was a passionate believer in the importance of arts in worship. And his great thing was that music was not an embellishment to the liturgy. It was a language that begins where words fail. And I think he was absolutely right. And he encouraged whatever we wanted to do, he would encourage it. And if he didn't like it, he'd say so in words which I would sometimes shudder when the choristers heard them. But he was always very genial about it. But he loved the music of the cathedral, and so did the clergy there. So that was a tremendous encouragement.
There certainly are musical clergy. I mean, indeed, the clergy of the Lutheran Church are actually trained in music since Luther said that they had to be.
Yeah.
And there are times, of course, when I remember presenters, for instance, the Bishop of Whitby, present Bishop of Whitby, Paul Ferguson, who was a very musical person, was trained very well in music. And it's a great help, of course, when that sort of thing can occur.
Yes, it is. And I think they realise when cathedral choirs don't always have good days. And I think they were more, he was understanding when we had a bad day.
Yes, quite so.
So that was important.
Have you ever tried to extend your musical composition beyond the church? In other words, have you tried to sort of put add-ons to church music in order to expand it into other spheres?
What, writing music other than the church, do you mean? Or?
Yes, or doing that and then combining the two, maybe.
I don't think so, but I've written quite a lot of instrumental music. I wrote a Cor Anglais sonata once, which has been performed once. And I think I'm going to transpose it so it can be played by an oboist. And I've written flute pieces, I've written orchestral pieces, an organ concerto, of course, which you so kindly gave me.
I did. I remember it very well. Thank you very much. But you've never put a Cor Anglais sonata as an interlude in the middle of an anthem or anything like that, I mean.
No, I haven't actually. Partly, I suppose, because there wasn't a Cor Anglais player around, although I could have done.
Quite. You need Bach's violinist.
Indeed, I know. Actually, that's not true. I wrote Ave Maris Stella. I wrote for a girls' school in Chippenham. I can't remember the name of it now. St Mary's Khan. That's right. Because they had a good viola player, and I wrote a setting of Ave Maris Stella for organ and viola and voice, which I was rather pleased about, actually. And I have done a Nubi Caritas with violin and flute and cello, which is based on the plain song, but that's only been sung once. So
now I've got a section on how you actually compose, how you start writing a composition. I remember the late John Scott said when somebody asked him if he composed, "No, I don't." He said, "The problem is what to do with the blank sheet of paper that lies in front of me."
I know the feeling only too well. And to begin with, when I was in my early days really seriously composing, I used to find it a struggle. And I used to get up in the middle of the night sometimes and try and work things out. And my mother would come into the drawing room and say, "You must come to bed. You're getting no sleep." She'd hear me thumping away on the piano. But I think you need some sort of plan. When you're setting words, you have some sort of architecture. But when you're writing instrumental music, you have to have some sort of form. And Stanford, in his book on musical composition, is very good about this. He says, take a well-known form like a Beethoven sonata or a Mozart sonata and use it as the model. You don't write the same notes, but use the first subject, the second subject, the development, have the bar numbers as Mozart or Handel or Mozart or Beethoven did. And that was a very good piece of advice. And in fact, the slow movement of the organ concerto is constructed in a very similar way to the slow movement of Brahms' double concerto,
Ah.
because that is such a wonderful piece.
You told me that the movement, was it the same piece that you'd copied the form of Mozart 40th Symphony?
Yes, I think the first movement.
Ah, yes, right.
And I think maybe the last movement is structurally based on the last movement of the 40th Symphony.
Ah.
But then, of course, at the end of the organ concerto, I come back to the opening theme.
That's good advice. So you said you had bars of music, melodies in your head as a child. Were you ever able, or are you ever able, to have a whole piece of music in your head and simply sit down and write it out as they said Mozart could?
No. I think I have an idea of what I want to say, but I tend not to find the notes until I'm sitting at the piano. And I write quite a lot at the piano, but when it comes to revisions, I revise away from the piano by trying to decide what's wrong with a piece. And there's always something wrong when you've written a piece. There's always something that you don't really like. And trying to decide what that is, I do that away from the piano.
It helps you to see it from afar, presumably.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Do you ever sketch a piece out in rough before you move on to the final event? In other words, do you have a sketchbook like Beethoven did? So it's there is your sketch, and from that you transfer to the final piece of music.
Sometimes I do that, yes. When I was younger, I used to have a sketchbook by the side of my bed. But I tend not to have a sketchbook by the side of my bed these days. Because I've got more time to compose, which is wonderful, I tend to sketch things out, sometimes just at the desk, about what I want to say and how I want to say it.
Would you admit to any extraneous influences, for instance, those of nature? I mean, Messiaen chose bird song, rainbows, stained glass, and all that kind of thing.
Yes, I love being in the country, living in the country, walking in the country. And I've not been to Cornwall for a long time, but I love the cliff walks in late summer when the sun is lower in the sky and the wind's blowing, the rain's not pouring down. And I've often found that very, very inspirational.
And so it's the general mood of being there, sort of thing.
Yes, and also buildings. I find buildings can be very inspiring. York is an obvious example, but I was inspired by Guildford when I got to know it a bit better, because there's a wonderful sense of peace about the building, which there's not really about Coventry. Coventry is a very busy building. Guildford is very much plainer, and
yes.
And I found that actually very inspirational.
It's the same sort of piece that I think I experienced when I was at Bury St Edmunds for a little while. Indeed, Barry Rose once said that he thought that Bury, rather than one of the ancient cathedrals, was one of the most inspiring liturgical buildings in the country.
Yes, I can understand that. Yes, it's a beautiful space.
You seem to achieve a marvelous balance in your composition between rhythm, harmony, and melody. How do you do that?
That's very kind of you to say that.
Searching question, I suppose, and maybe it can't be answered, but
a leading questions. I think my interest in rhythm partly sprang from my love of Tippett's Concerto for Double String Orchestra, which has such exciting rhythms, almost sprung rhythms in the way that Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry does. And I think that was an inspiration. The harmony, I think harmony is a funny thing. It has to be of the same language all the time. You can't write a piece of music with a lot of flattened leading notes and then suddenly have a a plagal, a perfect cadence in a minor key. That just wouldn't make sense. So I think I'm always acutely conscious of the harmonic language, but I'm also the melody. I suppose when it comes to church music, the words suggest a melody, and of course, with a melody, you've got to have a strong bass line. And I think Brahms was very keen, whatever style you're writing in, Brahms is very keen on this. And when his pupils used to arrive, he used to cover up the middle just to make sure that the top and the bottom were strong. And I think a strong bass line is very important.
So melody really governs the rest of the composition for you. I mean, that is the kind of opposite of Fauré, of whom they said that melody was really just the surface of harmony.
I think both are important, actually. And of course, if you write a fugue, which as you enjoy doing, I enjoy doing as well, you've got a ready-made melody there, and in fact, you've got two because you've got the counter subject and so forth, and
that's the generation of a whole piece from a melody.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So the bit now that I've called the nitty-gritty and asking you about trade secrets, if you have any.
Oh, lots, yes.
Yes. Do you, you've mentioned Vaughan Williams already, do you like Vaughan Williams suggested and write for 20 minutes a day, or do you wait for your muse to take you, or does it depend on when the commission falls through the letterbox?
I think the 20 minutes a day applied when I was at York and we were in the middle of term.
Yes.
And if I was in the middle of something, I had to find 20 minutes after lunch to write something quickly. But these days, I tend to write in the mornings. I like to be in the music room by about 9 o'clock until 1, with a break in the middle. And that doesn't always happen, obviously. Sorry?
That's what Schubert did.
Is it? Oh, right. How sensible. But then I write, if there's a commission, I'll go on with that. I've started a violin concerto, and I've written the first two movements and come to a full stop because I don't think I like the first movement. I think it needs drastic revision. So it's a bit of both, really. Muse and commissions are the spur.
So that really brings me to my next question was, do you ever revise anything or rewrite it?
I'm constantly revising when I've written a piece, constantly. I rewrote All Wisdom 3 times. The middle section in its first incarnation was far too short. Oh, the last movement, the fast bit. I thought this is over far too quickly. So I extended it and then extended it again. And I think I foisted upon you the second and the third versions.
Well, I wouldn't have known.
Good. So that was a big revision. And once it's in the computer, I write always on paper with a pencil and eraser. Once it's in the computer, I fiddle around a lot. And looking at manuscripts that I've written in the past, I see there's a great deal of cutting and pasting, of bits pasted over. So I think I fiddle around a great deal.
So you don't actually transfer it to Sibelius or whatever program you use till quite a late stage?
No, and it's late on. I find if you transpose onto Sibelius too early, you waste a lot of time. And it's much easier when you have a pretty complete idea of what you're writing, and then putting it onto Sibelius is a much quicker operation if you have a fairly detailed account of what you're writing.
I sometimes think Sibelius is too easy to write notes in.
It is. And I think the trouble with Sibelius is that a lot of people are writing a lot of music these days and putting it straight into Sibelius. And I think this is one of the dangers in schools. Some years ago, I went to Stowe School to look at some compositions, and they were all putting their things straight into Sibelius. And I said, you've got to think outside Sibelius with a pencil and rubber. And they thought it was a bit odd that I said that, but that's my feeling. But then I'm 77, so.
Yes, I was going to say good luck with the present technological generation as far as that's concerned.
I know.
So, a slightly naughty one here, I suppose. What's your favourite composition by Philip Moore?
Some time ago, I wrote a men's voice piece, which we sang in York. Lo, that is a marvelous change in the life of men. It's a pre-Christmas piece, and it's quite dark, and mostly root position chords. And I remember hearing it once in Guildford at a concert, and I was rather struck by it. And obviously, I love all wisdom, and my Bonhoeffer prayers I'm very fond of. And there's another piece which I heard on the radio quite by chance some years ago. It was an arrangement of an Irish tune. I can't remember the words now. Anyway, and I heard it, and I thought, I rather like that.
Sorry, I can't help you with that one.
No. It were my soul's desire to see the face of God. A tune by Charles Wood.
Oh, yes. He's another neglected composer. I'm extremely fond of some of his things.
I think his construction is absolutely fabulous. And they're the greatest pieces of his, like the Palm Sunday one. What is it called?
I know.
Glory and honor to thee.
Yes.
That's a fabulous piece.
It is. It is. We used to do a piece when I was at St Edmundsbury called Glorious and Powerful God, not the one that you know, but Glorious and Powerful God by Wood, with a big organ accompaniment. I used to think it was absolutely wonderful.
Yes, I think he's superb composer. Expectans expectavi.
That's absolutely marvellous.
Beautiful piece.
It's so short, and how he manages to fit such emotion into a piece of that length is quite extraordinary.
Can I tell you a funny story about that piece?
Please. Yes, please.
When I was at St Gabriel's Cricklewood as a student, we had a confirmation, and that piece builds up to a terrific climax. And then there's a chord, my soul keep white and whole. I built the big climax, and I suddenly heard, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. And I thought, blow you. And I put the chord down, and we sang the whole thing. And he had to say, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, again. And one of the church wardens came up to me and said, you should have let him go on. You were quite wrong. And the vicar, who was a wonderful man, he said, no, Philip was quite right. And moreover, the Bishop of Willesden had the piece at his consecration.
So finally, a few general questions. Since we're on a kind of desert island of your pieces, we'll continue that theme and ask you if you read a lot and what your favourite literature is.
Yes, I'm always reading. I always have a book on the go. Not two, because it's too confusing. I'm reading at the moment The Constant Gardener by John le Carré, which I'm finding slightly difficult. I've got through most of it, but it goes so far around the world that I get a bit confused. My little brain can't quite take in all the violent journeys that people take on that book, in that book. But I like a good autobiography or a good biography, and I've recently read Tom Bower's book about Boris Johnson, which is very interesting, and it shows what a dysfunctional family he came from. And then Mary Trump, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, is a very, very good read.
With friends like that.
Yeah, I know. And then I've got on my site another novel by somebody that is not well known, Ernest Raymond. I remember reading a book called We the Accused, which is wonderful. And I've just read Gentle Grieves. It's about a girl who he falls in love with when he's very young, and he follows her to the grave. and he is on my reading list.
It's one thing that I don't have time to do, but Le Carré, I'm very much in empathy with you about. There was that the televising recently of that rather wonderful, although rather violent film, The Night Manager.
Oh yes, yes.
Which was about selling arms to the Arabs.
Yes, yes.
But it was it held my attention like nobody's business, I must.
Yeah, I'm sure. Interesting man, and I saw his an interview just before or it was played just after he died, but he came across very well.
Oh yes,
very, very fair, very, very pleasant. And again, he had an extraordinary upbringing.
Yes,
the father who couldn't pay the school fees and so on and so forth.
So to come back to church music, what advice would you give to a young composer or would-be young composer of church music now?
Find a text that you like, that you can fall in love with. That's important. And take a text that's not too long. Alan Wicks was a wonderful critic of modern music, and he would sometimes sum up a piece and its weaknesses in only a few words. And he was once sent a piece of music by a modern composer, I forget who, and he looked at it and he said, "Too many words and not enough notes." And if you think, for instance, going back to Handel, the first chorus of the Messiah and the glory of the Lord, it's a most wonderful piece of thin textures, sometimes just going down to one voice. And then he builds the whole thing up. And I think you don't need too many words. And if you do have a lot of words, space them out, build them in sections, and give a lot of rests. If you're writing a choral piece, rests are important. This is where Stanford was very clever in pieces like his Requiem, which is why it sounded so well in the Minster when we did it, because there are bars when nothing happens and it just echoes around the building. And I think you need to give something space. Decide whether you're going to write 2, 3, or 4 parts or one part, and try and stick to that and make the parts interesting.
As far as Handel's economical text is concerned, Alleluia, of course.
Perfect.
the single word.
I know.
Ceases to become choral music at that stage, I sometimes think. But
yes, I know.
If the music's so good, then that's fine, of course.
Exactly. And he set words which nobody else would dare to set. Kings shall be thy nursing fathers, and queens thy nursing mothers, in one of the coronation anthems. Extraordinary.
He needed to live in England for a bit longer.
Well, he did. And actually, although I adore his music, his word setting is sometimes odd. And it was Tippett who pointed out that he obviously was not all that versed in the English language. He wrote a lot of Italian operas, as we know, some of which are absolutely fabulous.
His letters, of course, are a sight. His letters in English are a sight to behold. With and capital letters in all kinds of funny places, as if it was German. I mean, he kind of victimizes a particular word for a capital letter every so often because he found the idea. I think it's out of nostalgia or something.
I've not seen them. I must investigate them.
So, where do you think we are with musical history? This is, of course, a very, very difficult question, but do you think atonality, aleatoric music has actually worn itself out? And do you think we're in a kind of free-for-all at the moment as far as musical style is concerned? Or is it just that we're victims of the usual circumstance and we're too close to it in the generation that we're in and simply can't see what's going on?
I think we can't see what's going on. I think It's in some ways a pity that atonal music has gone out of fashion. I've written, and you probably have, um, 2 or 3 pieces which are based on tone rows.
Mm.
The piece I wrote for St Albans,
Mm.
the competition piece, and also a sinfonietta for organ, which I wrote some time ago. And it's a good technique if it's used properly. Aleatoric music, I think, unless you've got very skilled performers, they find it very difficult. I
Mm.
remember at Canterbury, Alan Wicks tried to get the cathedral choir to sing something aleatoric, and
Mm.
the men couldn't cope at all. The boys were much better, of course.
Mm.
But I think where we are now, it's very hard to say. When it comes to choral music, I think people have been seduced by the likes of Eric Whittaker and Morton Lawrenston, who I have to say, I loathe their music. I hate it because it's just lots of series of effects, and it's all very slow moving. And I think it means I don't think it's going to last. I think I don't know what's going to happen with classical music at all.
But Whitaker and people like him are retrospective. I mean, they are almost now moving backwards, having come to the brick wall of Stockhausen and so forth. You know, there's only one way to go, and that's back the way you came.
Yes,
So
yes.
maybe that's what they're trying to do, if indeed they're trying to do anything at all. But perhaps we should suggest they emulate John Cage.
Exactly. 4 minutes 33 seconds.
Yes,
There's
yes.
silence for you. But I think it's very hard to know what's going to happen. But I think there are serious composers around who may help over the course of the years to show a direction. I think James Macmillan, for instance, I think some of his music is absolutely wonderful. The Seven Last Words of the Cross and some of the choral music is extraordinarily fine. And I think Judith Weir writes very well. Judith Bingham is also an interesting composer.
Mhm.
And so I think there are people who are forging a style. Um,
When I heard the Ballad of Isabel Gowdy by James Macmillan, I was absolutely knocked sideways. I think
I
that's
know,
absolutely
wonderful piece.
fantastic.
Yes.
Do you think, I mean, we've experienced the demise of the church in our lifetimes, or at least certainly towards the end of our lives. Do you think that in people's consciousness has diminished the general importance of church music?
I think that cathedral music has become more popular, and I think probably music in churches um, is is probably less popular because so few people go to church. But we've seen the rise in the number of people who attended cathedral services. I mean, in our own time in York, I remember our first carol service together in 1983. There was just one carol service in the nave, and then suddenly, 2 or 3 years later, people started pouring in, so much so that we had to have 2 carol services. And I think, was it over the last 10 years, cathedral attendance has gone up 20%.
Gosh.
And I think after this pandemic, I think cathedrals will be even fuller of people because they won't necessarily want to go to their parish church. They'll want to go and experience something which is outside themselves and which speaks a language that they don't necessarily understand, but is, as Tony Bridge said, is beyond words. And I think that once we're out of this terrible situation, I think people are going to crowd into the cathedrals.
Let's hope so.
Yes. And I think also that clergy these days are much more sympathetic to cathedral music. You know, at one stage it was often, to what purpose does this waste? But I think cathedral clergy now realize that if it wasn't for the music, their services would be dead, and their buildings would be dead.
Some of them like it and some of them don't.
Yes.
Philip, thank you very much. That was an absolutely fascinating insight into your thoughts about music, about how you compose, and about the music you have composed. Thank you very much indeed.
It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, John. Thank you so much for your searching questions.
Not too searching.
No, no.